All right, welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive? Today, we're going deep, really deep into a topic that's, well, it's kind of a philosophical minefield. The ethics of belief.
Mhm.
Buckle up.
Yeah, we're going to be asking, how should we think? What are the rules of the game when it comes to what we accept as true? Can we just believe anything we want, or are there, intellectual obligations?
Exactly. And that's the really juicy part. We're
Yeah.
talking about the tension between, believing something even if the evidence is a bit shaky versus the responsibility to only believe what's demonstrably true. Heady stuff, right?
For sure. And this is right in the wheelhouse for us philosophers, because it's not just about what's possible to believe, but what we ought to believe. How should our beliefs line up with knowledge, with justification, with rationality itself?
Big questions. And to help us navigate this whole maze, we're turning to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on, you guessed it, the ethics of belief. It's kind of like the ultimate guidebook for this debate. So where do we even start with this?
Well, like many great philosophical debates, there's a spark, a moment where things ignite. In this case, it's William Kington Clifford's 1877 essay, The Ethics of Belief. And let me tell you, Clifford did not mess around.
Lay it on us. What was his big idea?
He stated flat out, it is wrong, always, everywhere, and for anyone to believe anything on insufficient evidence. Full stop. Strong words. Think about that for a second. Always, everywhere, anyone. It's not just about being wrong here and there. It's about a fundamental duty.
Wow, that's a bold statement.
Yeah.
Always, everywhere, no exceptions. That's a serious claim. What led him to take such a firm stance?
Clifford used this powerful analogy about a ship owner, someone who was having doubts, real worries about whether his ship was seaworthy, needed repairs. But he pushed those doubts aside, convinced himself it was fine, sold tickets, and sent that ship out to sea. And then, of course, tragedy. It sank. Everyone lost.
A terrible, terrible outcome.
And Clifford's point was that ship owner was responsible, guilty for the deaths of those people, not just because he was negligent, but because he had no right to believe the ship was safe based on what he knew.
So it wasn't just the sinking itself, it was the act of believing without enough evidence.
Right. Clifford said even if the ship had somehow made it, the ship owner would still be morally in the wrong for forming that belief in the first place. It's about how we arrive at our beliefs, not just the outcome.
Tough standard, right? Makes you think twice about all the little things we believe without rock-solid proof. So who stepped up to challenge this, well, this pretty hardcore view?
That would be William James, coming in a few decades later in 1896 with his essay, The Will to Believe. Now, James really respected Clifford's emphasis on intellectual honesty, but he thought Clifford's principle was too rigid, especially in those situations where the evidence just isn't clear-cut. James argued that sometimes our passions, our hopes and fears have to play a role.
So it's not just about cold, hard evidence. What was James's alternative?
He talked about these things called genuine options, choices that are big, unavoidable, and where logic alone can't settle the matter. In those cases, he said, our desires, our feelings, they can and sometimes must guide us. Think about falling in love. You don't have a spreadsheet proving it'll work out, but your longing for connection can lead you to believe, to take a leap of faith.
That makes sense. It's a very different approach to belief than Clifford's.
Mm-hmm.
So we have this major clash of ideas in the late 19th century, but this wasn't a completely new conversation, was it?
Not at all. The big names might be from the 1800s, but the roots of this go way back. Descartes, for instance, in his Meditations, put the intellect front and center. He said, you got to withhold judgment on anything you don't perceive clearly and distinctly.
So basically, don't believe anything unless it's absolutely certain.
Hmm.
But we can't walk around like that all the time, can we?
That's right. Descartes knew we need to function in the world. In practical matters, he said it's okay, even necessary, to form opinions based on probability, on what seems likely.
So a bit of wiggle room there. What about Locke? He seems like a kindred spirit with Clifford.
Oh, yeah. Locke, in his essay concerning human understanding, was even stricter. He actually used moral language when talking about belief. He said believing without good reason is like misusing your God-given brain power. For him, it was a moral duty to make sure your beliefs were in proportion to the evidence.
So Locke and Clifford both saying, hey, irresponsible belief is wrong, not just intellectually, but morally. But you mentioned some earlier figures who were closer to James's way of thinking.
That's right. Pascal, for one. His famous wager is all about the practical benefits of believing in God, even if you're not 100% sure. Basically, the potential reward is so huge, eternal bliss, it outweighs any risk. And Kant, while super focused on the limits of reason, said that for moral action, we might have to accept certain things as true, even if we can't prove them definitively.
Okay, so this idea that there are different kinds of shoulds when it comes to belief, it's not just about true or false.
Exactly. We have prudential norms, what's good for us to believe. Like maybe believing you'll recover from an illness can actually help you heal.
Right, the power of positive thinking. So believing something because it's beneficial, not necessarily because it's guaranteed to be true. But there are other kinds of norms too.
Yep. Moral norms. Is it okay to believe gossip about a friend, even if it seems kind of plausible? And then, of course, epistemic norms. These are all about truth, knowledge, avoiding error. That's Clifford and Locke's territory.
Okay, so a whole bunch of different shoulds, potentially pulling us in different directions. And I gather these norms can have different structures too. Hypothetical versus categorical.
That's right. Prudential norms are usually hypothetical. Like, if you want to feel less stressed, then maybe believe everything's going to be okay. But moral and epistemic norms, they're often seen as categorical. They apply to everyone, regardless of your desires or goals. You ought to seek truth. You ought to be fair in your judgments, just because that's what a rational, moral person does.
So hypothetical norms are like, if you want X, then do Y. But categorical norms are more like, do Y, period.
Yeah. Though you could argue that even something like survival, usually seen as a prudential thing, is pretty darn fundamental. It's not really optional.
Yeah, that's a good point. Our drive to survive might be so basic, it becomes almost like a categorical imperative.
Exactly. So even a prudential norm in that case could have this really strong, almost inescapable quality.
Now, let's talk about this idea of reflective access. Does it matter how aware we are of why we believe something?
It gets kind of meta, right?
Mhm.
Some philosophers say for a norm to really guide us, we need to grasp why we hold a belief, what purpose it serves. Like a rule that just says, believe this if it leads to good outcome X. Well, we might be following it blindly without even realizing it.
Which doesn't seem like a very conscious way to form our beliefs.
Right. So a norm with reflective access would be more like, if you know believing this will help you get outcome X, then believe it. But then do you need to know that you know, and so on? It can get a bit tangled. But the point is, the level of awareness, of understanding our own reasons, might matter for whether a belief is ethically sound.
Okay, so potentially a whole lot of introspection involved here. And how do these different types of norms, prudential, moral, epistemic, unization, how do they all fit together? Is one more important, or do they all have equal weight?
It's a big question. Some folks, the value marnists, say there's really just one fundamental value underpinning everything, and that's usually truth. They're called veritists. For them, all our intellectual efforts should be aimed at getting to the truth. Everything else is secondary.
So for a veritist, truth trumps everything else, even happiness or social harmony.
Pretty much. But others argue for a more pluralistic view. They say maybe aesthetic values matter, maybe social or political values play a role. Imagine a community where believing certain stories, even if they're not perfectly proven, is crucial for social cohesion.
Interesting. So a bit like sometimes the value of believing this outweighs the need for strict proof.
Yeah. The question then becomes, can we reduce these other types of norms back to the main three? Are social norms really just about promoting well-being, which would be prudential, or about fairness, which would be moral? Clifford tried to link the epistemic and the moral directly. He argued that we have an epistemic duty to base our beliefs on evidence and a moral duty to fulfill our epistemic duty. Therefore, believing without evidence is morally wrong.
But is it really that straightforward? Just because I have an intellectual responsibility, does that automatically mean I'm a bad person if I mess up?
Right. That's the key point of contention, is there always this moral obligation to be intellectually responsible. Clifford argued that even seemingly private beliefs can have wider consequences. Believing things on flimsy evidence can, lower our standards overall, make us more gullible in general, which could then lead to harmful actions.
So a slippery slope argument. Like believing one little unfounded thing could make us more likely to believe other more dangerous falsehoods.
Exactly. And virtue epistemologists go even further. They say bad intellectual habits, like being lazy or closed-minded, can reflect a flawed moral character.
So intellectually sloppy equals morally suspect. That's a thought-provoking link. But what about when these different norms clash? We talked about that example of wanting to believe your son is innocent, even if the evidence points the other way.
Yeah, those situations are tough. The entry gives tons of examples. What's best for us versus what's actually true, moral considerations versus intellectual honesty, even clashes within epistemic norms. Like, You have a duty to gather evidence, but also a duty to make a decision at some point. So how do we deal with these conflicts?
It sounds like a recipe for serious inner turmoil. Do we just have to pick one norm and stick with it?
Well, some say there's always a right answer, that there's a hierarchy of norms or a way to weigh them. But others argue that some norms are just incommensurable. You can't really compare them directly. And then there's the idea that maybe one category is fundamental and everything else reduces to that. Like maybe epistemic rationality is just a form of long-term prudence.
That's pretty mind-bending. This whole debate gets very meta very quickly. Okay, let's zoom in on belief itself. What is it exactly? Does it matter for this ethics discussion how we define belief?
Interestingly, that hasn't been the main battleground so far. There's general agreement that belief is, like, a disposition, a tendency to affirm something, and those dispositions come in degrees. But the bigger issue has been the aims of belief. What are we trying to do when we believe?
Aims, like the purpose or goal of believing.
Right, what's belief for? Many say the main aim is to get at the truth. That naturally supports the idea that evidence matters. But others have said maybe it's about knowledge or justification or intellectual virtue or understanding, or even some cognitive scientists say survival.
Survival, how does that work?
The idea is that our brains, including our belief-forming mechanisms, evolve and help us navigate the world and stay alive. But whether that always lines up with truth is debatable. Like, maybe sometimes a false belief could help you survive in a tricky situation.
That's a fascinating and maybe slightly disturbing thought. What about aims that are less about truth and more about, feeling good,
Yeah.
pleasure, belonging, that kind of thing? Could those ever justify a belief?
If those were legitimate aims, it would really shake things up. It could justify self-deception, wishful thinking, if those led to happiness or a stronger sense of belonging. It gets us into all the messiness of human psychology. So our understanding of what belief is for really shapes the rules we think should apply. It's a bit like consequentialism in ethics. The outcome matters.
I see the parallel. Truth is the aim, kind of like maximizing good consequences. But if there are other aims, it gets more complicated.
Right. If truth is the only aim, it's like monistic consequentialism in ethics, but with some key differences. If there are multiple aims, it's more like rule consequentialism or even deontology. And some even say maybe belief doesn't have a specific aim, which throws a real wrench in the works.
Okay, so the purpose of belief itself is up for debate. Now, there's this idea of knowledge is the norm of belief. What's that about?
This view says you should only believe something if you know it. Knowing is both necessary and sufficient for believing. The argument is, knowledge is the norm for assertion you shouldn't say something unless you know it. And belief is like the internal version of assertion.
So, internal consistency. If you wouldn't say it out loud, you shouldn't believe it in your head either.
Right. But one problem is, we often act on beliefs that fall short of knowledge. We make decisions with incomplete information all the time. If only knowledge counted, we'd be paralyzed. Plus, knowledge seems like a higher bar than just justified true belief. It feels like a different kind of achievement.
Makes sense. So knowledge might be too high a standard for everyday belief. Now here's a really big one. How much control do we have over our beliefs? If we can't choose what to believe, how can we be responsible for them?
That's the heart of the doxastic involuntarist challenge. It's a huge problem for the whole idea of an ethics of belief. Many say belief is largely involuntary. We can't just decide to believe something on a whim, regardless of the evidence. So if it's not really up to us, how can there be duties or obligations? It's like saying, you have a moral obligation to grow taller. Well, that doesn't make sense if it's not something I can control.
Right. It seems strange to have an ethical duty regarding something we can't directly influence.
For sure. So some philosophers say maybe we have some direct control over some beliefs, or at least over suspending judgment or revising beliefs. Others say maybe it's more about indirect control. We can choose what evidence to seek out, what sources to trust, like reading a well-researched book versus just scrolling through social media. That choice can shape your beliefs down the line.
So it's not about instinct control, but about making choices that influence the long game of belief formation.
Exactly. And some have brought in this concept of acceptance, which is more deliberate than belief. You might accept a theory for the sake of argument or to guide your actions, even if you don't fully believe it.
Acceptance as a more conscious, volitional counterpart to belief.
Right. Acceptance is something we can be held accountable for, even if our underlying beliefs are more passive.
Okay, that's a really interesting distinction. It gets us back to evidentialism, which puts evidence front and center. What's the core idea there in a nutshell?
Evidentialism says, base your beliefs on the relevant evidence you have. Simple, right? In its strongest form, it says your belief is only justified to the extent that it's backed up by evidence. No evidence, no justification. And many evidentialists believe in proportioning the strength of your belief should match the strength of the evidence. Like, don't believe something wholeheartedly if the evidence is just a whisper.
And as we said before, there are different levels of strictness.
Totally. Strict evidentialism. Clifford's the poster child for this, says evidence is always, everywhere required, no exceptions. But that gets tricky, like, do you need evidence for your evidence, and so on. And what counts as enough evidence? Moderate evidentialism is more chill, allowing for some exceptions, especially in low-stakes situations.
So there's a spectrum from always need proof to sometimes you got to wing it.
Right. But even moderate evidentialists say, in high-stakes scenarios, like, flying a plane or making public health decisions, evidence is non-negotiable. And it's not just about the evidence you have right now, it's also about how you've gathered and evaluated evidence over time. That's the difference between synchronic and diachronic evidentialism.
Synchronic being the snapshot, diachronic being the long game of intellectual development.
Right. Clifford's famous line is synchronic, but he also talked about the duty to seek out evidence, to be open to new information, to revise your beliefs when necessary. Virtue epistemology is big on this, saying, cultivate good intellectual habits and you'll naturally end up with well-supported beliefs.
Makes sense. It's about being a responsible thinker over time, not just in isolated moments. And what counts as evidence anyway? It seems like a pretty broad category.
Oh yeah, that's a key question for evidentialists. Evidence could be proofs, probabilities, sensory experiences, testimony from experts, anything that informs your beliefs. You need a theory of evidence itself to say what counts for what. And you need to explain how evidence connects to belief and what it means to possess evidence. Like, is it the fact itself or your awareness of the fact? It gets complicated.
So a lot to unpack there, but we've spent a lot of time on evidentialism. What about the alternative? What does non-evidentialism look like?
Well, non-evidentialism says sometimes it's okay, maybe even required, to believe something without meeting those evidential standards. Practical non-evidentialism, championed by James, is all about practical reasons for belief. James's right to believe in those tough choices where logic can't decide, Pascal's wager with its potential for infinite reward, Kant's morally necessary taking to be true, they all fit here.
So it's like saying sometimes the benefits of believing, or the moral reasons for believing, can outweigh the need for proof.
Exactly. Then there's conservative non-evidentialism. This one says you're justified in believing something just because you already do believe it or because it seems true to you as long as there's no reason to doubt it. Like, if you see a tree, you're justified in believing there's a tree there, even if you don't have a philosophical argument for it.
Right. We can't be constantly second-guessing every basic belief we have. So it's about starting with a presumption of justification, unless there's a reason to think otherwise.
Yeah. And you can combine that with evidentialism in other areas, saying basic beliefs are fine, but bigger controversial claims need stronger evidence.
Okay, that's a nuanced approach. What's the last main type of non-evidentialism?
That would be fideistic non-evidentialism. This one says faith can justify belief even without evidence, even against evidence. Thinkers like Tertullian and Kierkegaard come to mind. But this is tricky because belief often feels involuntary. You can't just force yourself to believe something you find unconvincing.
So fideism might work better if it's more about accepting certain doctrines, living as if they're true, rather than forcing yourself to believe them against all odds.
That's right. And that brings us back to the acceptance idea. It helps make sense of those situations where we commit to something, even without airtight proof.
Right. Acceptance as a kind of middle ground, a more conscious way of treating something as true, even if we don't have full-blown belief.
Yeah.
It's been an incredible deep dive. This whole ethics of belief thing, it's a real rabbit hole, isn't it?
Absolutely. It forces us to think about the core of our intellectual lives, the values that drive our thinking, and the responsibility we have for what we believe.
And we've seen this whole range of perspectives, from Clifford's hardline to James's more flexible approach, each with its own justifications, whether based on truth, morality, or practicality.
So, to wrap things up, a final thought for you, dear listener. If belief isn't entirely under our control, what does that mean for the whole idea of an ethics of belief? Can we really have duties about things we can't fully choose? Maybe focusing on acceptance, on those more deliberate commitments, is a better path. And how do these different approaches to belief play out in the real world, in philosophy itself?
Big questions to ponder. And to help you on your journey, check out the works of the thinkers we've discussed today: Clifford, James, Descartes, Locke, Kant. Dig into those different theories, really wrestle with these ideas.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We hope it's been a stimulating and maybe even a little unsettling exploration of what it means to believe. Keep those philosophical gears turning.